بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وعلى كل من تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا يا أرحم الراحمين. أما بعد. My respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to welcome everyone to this session of Introduction to Al-Hidayah. But I want to clarify before I start the session that I know many participants today, they are in the position of being my teachers, in the position of my teacher. So, and also many learned people have also registered and they have also joined today. So therefore, today's session is not a teaching or training, rather it's kind of mudhakara with Ahlul Ilm, and inshallah we'll remind each other about this great contribution made by Al-Imam Al-Marghinani, the author of Al-Hidayah. So let's start, inshallah. The purpose of this webinar is to get ourselves familiar with the author of Al-Hidayah, Al-Imam Al-Marghinani, to learn about his book, Al-Hidayah, and also to appreciate his contribution, his legacy. And therefore, we can be motivated to study those works that they left behind for us as a legacy, and we can also benefit ourselves and benefit the Ummah, inshallah. So this is the objective, as you can see, and let's move on to the next slide. So before we dive in to talk about Al-Hidayah, the traditional and the standard textbook of Hanafi fiqh, we'd like to know a bit about Imam Al-Marghinani rahmatullahi alayhi, his biography. It's interesting that some ulama from the past, they dedicated books on Imam Al-Marghinani, his life story, his biography, his contribution to Islamic science, fiqh especially. So one of the books survived, and we have hold of this book, which is called Al-Iqd Al-Thamin. It's not Al-Aqd, it's Al-Iqd Al-Thamin, authored by Allama Hamid Al-Imadi rahmatullahi alayhi, who died in 1171 AH. Not many years before, like 3 centuries before. So Hamid Al-Imadi rahmatullahi alayhi, he authored a book, Al-Iqd Al-Thamin, fi tarjamati sahib al-hidayah Burhan al-Din. It's not big, it's a small booklet about Al-Imam Al-Marghinani, where Hamid Al-Imadi, this faqih, this great imam, this great alim, he wrote Marghinani's biography. He described, explained the books of Marghinani and some topics related to Al-Hidayah. But if you look at his book, Hamid Al-Imadi's book, Al-Iqd Al-Thamin, you will not find many information regarding the personal life of Al-Marghinani. In fact, we don't have much information about Imam Al-Marghinani's personal life. Few information we can get hold of, and these are mentioned here. Imam Marghinani rahimahullah, he is called Marghinan. He is referred to the place Marghinan, which is nowadays called Marghilan. So in Arabic we say Marghinan, but in Uzbek they say Marghilan. In the new map, they named the place as Marghilan in Uzbekistan, in Central Asia. And this is why the author of Al-Hidayah is called Al-Marghinani, because he was born in Marghinan. Marghinan is a city in Farghana province of Uzbekistan. So therefore, he is called Al-Farghani as well. He is also called Ar-Rushdani, because the village where he was born, it's Rushdan, or nowadays they say Rushdan. So because of that, he also called Rushtani, Marghinani, Farghani. He was born after Asr on Monday, the 8th of Rajab, and that was 511 AH, which is 1117. Imam Marghinani rahimahullah's first name, his name is Ali, and his father's name is Abu Bakr, and he is, Imam Marghinani is, they are descendants of Sahabi Khalifatul Muslimin Abu Bakr radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. And Imam Marghinani rahimahullah, he received his early education in his own local area, Uzbekistan, the area Ma'ara al-Nahar. And because at that time, we need to understand that at this time, the time was, for like those centuries was golden eras of Islamic education, the development of Islamic sciences, hadith, fiqh, etc. So Imam Marghinani rahimahullah's environment was so appealing and welcoming for him to learn and for him to develop his skills and education. So therefore, Imam Marghinani rahimahullah, he studied under many great scholars of his time. In fact, Marghinani rahmatullahi alayhi, he wrote a complete book. He dedicated a booklet or book about his shuyukh, from whom he learned hadith, from whom he learned fiqh and other Islamic sciences. Imam Marghinani's book that he wrote, he authored about his shuyukh, about his teachers, is called Mashyikha, or Mu'jamu Shuyukh al-Marghinani. Unfortunately, this Mashyikha, this book about his teachers, did not survive, or we don't know about this book at this point. However, Abdul Qadir al-Qurashi, rahmatullahi alayhi, the author of Al-Jawahir al-Mudiyya, one of the biographical dictionary of Hanafi fiqh, Al-Jawahir al-Mudiyya fi Tarajim al-Hanafiyya. In that book, Abdul Qadir al-Qurashi, rahmatullahi alayhi, he quotes a lot from Imam Marghinani's Mashyikha. That is one of the good things, that even though we don't have the book Mashyikha in front of us, however, we can learn, we can get an idea of the kitab from Abdul Qadir al-Qurashi's Al-Jawahir al-Mudiyya. Because Abdul Qadir al-Qurashi, he says that he studied the kitab Mashyikha, and from that he quoted in many places some beneficial points from Mashyikha. And alhamdulillah, in my recently published book, Al-Madkhal ila Kitab Al-Hidayah, I tried to gather all these quotes that Abdul Qadir al-Qurashi quoted from Mashyikhas of Imam Marghinani, the author of Al-Hidayah. So if anyone is interested, you can look at Al-Madkhal, and you can see nearly 30 people or 30 teachers from whom Imam Marghinani learned hadith or fiqh, and their names are mentioned in Mashyikha. The book Al-Mashyikha, I mentioned it because it's really important for many reasons. Number one, through these kind of books, Mashyikha, we can learn the scholars of that time who used to teach, who were involved in and engaged in teachings of Islamic education. Number two is we can learn the books that used to be studied at that time, meaning the books which were popular at this time, and the students used to read those books as a syllabus, as a curriculum of that time. Number three, from this book of Mashyikha, we also learn that Al-Imam Al-Marghinani, the author of Al-Hidayah, he was not just an ordinary person or ordinary scholar of fiqh. Rather, he combined between fiqh and hadith. Because from this book, we see he mentions the teachers from whom he learned the Kutub as-Sitta, Bukhari, Muslim, all these well-known books. He mentions even a different narration different way of like different nuskhas of Tirmidhi or other books. So this tells us, and this shows us that Imam Marghinani rahimahullah was involved also in studying hadith, not just fiqh. And this is important for a faqih, because if the faqih can combine between fiqh and hadith, then his legal verdicts, the fatwa that he provides, will be more balanced and based on the evidence. Therefore, it's important for us to know about the mashayikh of Imam Al-Marghinani, and therefore it was mentioned here. Imam Marghinani rahimahullah, he did perform Hajj as well in the Hijri year 544. So he was about 33 years old at that time. This is also important. Perhaps in this day and age, we don't pay much attention to that point, that in the history, our ulama, our scholars, early scholars, they used to go for the journey of Hajj. Yes, obviously to perform Hajj, to fulfill the obligation of Hajj, but alongside multiple intentions. So alongside that intention was to meet different scholars, to visit places, and to learn from different ulama of different countries, because this was a meeting point for Muslim Ummah. Ulama from Andalus, from East, West, many parts of the world, they would gather for Hajj. And a student of knowledge would utilize this journey to learn from them, to meet them, liqa, ziyara, and also to do istifada, to benefit from them, from their experience, from their ilm. So that's why when we talk about early scholars, we mention about the journeys of Hajj, because that journey that he took was not just an ordinary journey. Nowadays, we go for Hajj, we travel with via plane, we come back, we don't feel attached to those places because it's a quick journey, just go and come back. However, they used to take journeys, at that time, slowly, step by step, and they would prepare themselves when entering the holy places, etc. And they would meet ulama, learn from them, sit in their gatherings and majlis. So we see Marghinani rahimahullah, when he was only 33 years old, he performed Hajj, and obviously that Hajj developed, the journey of Hajj developed his skills of fiqh and hadith, and obviously he met different ulama from Arab and non-Arab countries. Marghinani rahimahullah, the author of Al-Hidayah, we don't know much about his family life, but we know 3 sons of him. They were also scholars, Muhammad, Umar, and Imaduddin. And in fact, they have books as well. Some of the books are printed and some of them will be printed. So his family, he maintained to train his family as well, his children as well. So they also carried out educational activity after him. This is also a lesson for us, that if I myself is involved and interested in Islamic education and activities, then we should pass on this to our offspring and next generation. So then our ilm can survive more longer and people can benefit from this ilm more and more, inshallah. And finally, Imam Al-Marghinani, the author of Al-Hidayah, he passed away in Samarkand, in Uzbekistan, today's Uzbekistan, at the age of 82, according to Hijri calendar. He died in 14th of Dhul Hijjah in the Hijri year 593. One of the funny things about, or kind of interesting, that Imam Marghinani, when he died in Samarkand, people took his body to bury in a maqbara, in a graveyard, which is called Turbatul Muhammadin, meaning that graveyard, that maqbara, is specifically only for those people who died and their name was Muhammad. So people, the people who were taking Imam Marghinani's body, they wanted to bury him in that maqbara, in that graveyard, but people, those who were in charge of Turbatul Muhammadin, they did not allow to bury Imam Al-Marghinani in that graveyard because his name does not match with the criteria of this maqbara Muhammad, because his name is not Muhammad, his name is Ali. So that happened. And this Turbatul Muhammadin, I heard from ulama, from scholars who visited Uzbekistan and that place, they said this Turbatul Muhammadin, this place is still there, meaning people can visit and see that maqbara, it still exists. So that was really short, brief biography of Imam Al-Marghinani. We'll focus more on his Kitab Al-Hidayah, inshallah. This is just a few pictures, the traditional silk cloth of Uzbekistan, which they sell now today in Marghilan and all those places, and also traditional bread, you can see. The next point is Al-Marghinani's literary work. Imam Al-Marghinani, rahimahullah, he did not author many books. Rather, if we look really into his biography and the books that he produced, and we can get hold of them, we find out that he authored only 12 books. Only 12 books. However, these books are exceptional and like wonderful books, excellent works of fiqh mostly. So because the quality is so high and the books are so beneficial and important, therefore, even though he wrote less, but his legacy survived till today, and inshallah will be surviving long centuries ahead. So it's not always about the quantity, it's about quality. Many people, they tend to write many books, and they think that if I write many books, maybe that will survive more. But in reality, we see this is not the case. Sometimes people author or compile one single book, but this becomes a means of him being alive in the Islamic libraries. So Imam Al-Marghinani, rahimahullah, he authored only 12 books. Some of them have already been printed. For example, as you see this book, Bidayatul Mubtadi, which is actually the main text of Al-Hidayah. And this Bidayatul Mubtadi was printed by Hamid Ibrahim Kursun in Egypt. And that book was in the last century Hijri. And that book was included in the syllabus of Al-Azhar. Here in this old edition of Bidayatul Mubtadi, you can see طبع على نفقة حامد إبراهيم كرسون وكل نسخة لم تختم بختمه فهي مسروقة. It's interesting, funny that the book was obviously sponsored, printed by Hamid Ibrahim Kursun. He sponsored the edition of this kitab, but any nuskha which was not stamped with his signature, with his seal, it's considered to be masruq, like stolen. So as you can see in this nuskha, we have his stamp placed here, Hamid Ibrahim Kursun. So that was the first, or I'm not sure the first or its earliest edition of Bidayatul Mubtadi. Then we have another one, which is recent. And this Bidayatul Mubtadi was edited by Dr. Said Bagdash, the son-in-law of our Shaykh Muhammad Awwam, Hafizahullah. This edition was printed by Al-Furqan Institute, which has different branches in different countries, but mainly based in London. Another book, you can see Mukhtaratun Nawazil in 3 or 4 volumes, also printed. And another book of Al-Marghinani called At-Tajnis wal Mazid, again related to fiqh, also was printed in Pakistan. And there are some other books which did not survive, or which are lost basically, or they are not printed yet. Maybe they are held in some manuscript libraries somewhere in the world. And these few books are printed, and the most important book of Marghirani is Al-Hidayah, that we are going to talk about now, inshallah. In order to understand the Kitab Al-Hidayah, how it was designed and how it works, we should look at this diagram. You can see that Hidayah is actually rooted from these books. First of all, Imam Al-Marghirani rahimahullah, he authored a book called Al-Bidayah, meaning Bidayat al-Mubtadi, that we just saw the picture of it. And in that book of Bidayat al-Mubtadi, Marghirani rahimahullah combined two main texts of Hanafi jurisprudence, Hanafi fiqh. One is Al-Jami' al-Saghir, Al-Jami' al-Saghir by Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, the direct student of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, who died in 189 Hijri. And also Marghirani combined this book, Mukhtasar al-Quduri, Imam Quduri's book. Imam Quduri, also one of the prominent Hanafi scholars, he died in 428 Hijri. So Marghirani based his book Bidayat al-Mubtadi on these two works, and he combined them, he designed them, restructured them in his book Bidayat al-Mubtadi. Therefore, Marghirani thought this is a precise and comprehensive text. Perhaps it requires explanation. So Marghirani rahimahullah, first of all, he did this one, Al-Kifaya, meaning Kifayatul Muntahi, Sharhu Bidayat al-Mubtadi. But Marghirani rahimahullah was very generous with this sharah, with this commentary of Bidayah, titled Al-Kifaya, Kifayatul Muntahi, that he mentioned all the relevant details of masail, issues of fiqh, that to an extent that it became 80 volumes. So Kifayatul Muntahi became a book of 80 volumes, which was quite long book, and it is not like easy for everyone to study and to read that book from beginning to the end. So therefore Marghirani rahimahullah later on, he decided to shorten this, to make a shorter version of Kifayatul Muntahi, and that is called Al-Hidayah, Sharh Bidayat al-Mubtadi. So Al-Hidayah is actually the sharah of Bidayat al-Mubtadi, the commentary of Bidayat al-Mubtadi. And Bidayat al-Mubtadi is based on these two primary sources of Hanafi fiqh, Al-Jami' al-Saghir and Mukhtasar al-Quduri. But we should also understand that Hidayah and Kifaya, they are not exactly same, even though they both are commentaries of Bidayat al-Mubtadi, but they deal in a different way. There are differences in between these two sharah. Imam Badruddin al-Aini rahimahullah, who died in 855 Hijri, he claims that Kifayatul Muntahi is lost. So if Al-Aini claims that at that time, if he claimed that at that time, then what can we say in our time? Most likely it didn't survive, or we don't have, we can't get hold of this book yet. Let's look at this slide where we see the beginning when Imam Marghirani started this book, Al-Hidayah. As you can see, the second point, Imam Marghirani rahimahullah, he started his book on Wednesday, Dhul Qada, and in the year 573. So Marghirani was born 511 Hijri, and he started writing this book in 573, and he died in 593. If we remember these dates, so he started writing, compiling Al-Hidayah 20 years before he left this dunya, 20 years before he died. And at that time, his age was 62. This is also important. Why? Because that means, that demonstrates, that shows that Imam Marghirani rahimahullah at that time, he has reached the age where he was well experienced. He had already experienced writing books and teaching books to the students and explaining things to the ulama. So he was well experienced at that time. So if ulama write something at their later life, that means that would be more precise and more like excellent than those works that they have done in their early age. And obviously, as we know, Imam Marghinani at that time, he had already compiled Kifayatul Muntahi, Bidayatul Mubtadi, and other works. So Al-Hidayah was more stronger in terms of its Al-Hidayah was more beneficial for the students, and it has all these, it includes all this experience that Imam Marghinani rahimahullah had acquired throughout his age 62. And it's interesting to mention that Imam Marghinani rahimahullah specifically, particularly, he started the work on a Wednesday. And the reason is mentioned in several sharh, several commentaries of Al-Hidayah, and several books. Imam Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi and other ulama, they also mentioned the reason why Imam Marghinani chose Wednesday to begin to commence his work is Imam Marghinani had a tradition. He got this tradition, he got this narration narrated through his own chain of narration, that any work, any valuable, important work which is started, which has begun on Wednesday, will most likely completed, will be done. So therefore, Imam Marghinani rahimahullah chose to start his work on Wednesday. But there is a long discussion on that tradition, the authenticity of that tradition. Is it a Sahih Hadith? Is it an established tradition of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam or not? This discussion can be found in Al-Madkhal, inshallah, or in Al-Fawaid al-Bahiyya fi Tarazim al-Hanafiyya, authored by Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi rahimahullah. I'm not going to into this discussion now, but it's interesting that many ulama, they specifically, intentionally, deliberately, they start their works, important academic works, on Wednesday. And this is the last point, is the secret of Imam Marghinani's book Al-Hidayah and other works to being accepted and appreciated widely even today. After 850 years after his death, we are still admiring and appreciating his work. The secret is, as you can see, Imam Marghinani rahimahullah, he took 13 years to complete this work, Al-Hidayah. And during that time, that long duration, Imam Marghinani rahimahullah would be fasting. He would observe Sawm, fasting during that time, in order to in order to demonstrate his ikhlas, sincerity, and in order to seek Allah's pleasure and the acceptance of his work. So Marghinani rahimahullah maintained fasting throughout these 13 years when he was compiling and writing Al-Hidayah. And it's also amazing that he did not allow anyone, he didn't let anyone to know about his secret, about his sincere fasting. Whenever the khadim, the servant, would bring food to him for lunch to him, he wouldn't say, "I'm fasting." He wouldn't reject the lunch, or rather he would keep it. And then after the khadim went, he give this food to someone else, maybe to another student, to another needy person. And when the khadim would come back to take the plates, etc. back, he would see all of these are empty. This is how he maintained the sincerity of his fasting during compiling the book Al-Hidayah. So that was few points about Al-Hidayah. The next slide. There are a few important aspects to remember before we dive in to talk about Al-Hidayah. The book Al-Hidayah was so appreciated, and even today it's so appreciated by the learned people, scholars, educators throughout the Muslim world, that in our history, some ulama, some students, they tried to memorize the entire book Al-Hidayah. Can you imagine? Al-Hidayah is not a short book. So they memorized the entire book. Some of them are titled as Qari'ul Hidayah. Nowadays we say Qari Sab to ulama, those who teach children Quran, we call them Qari Sab. So there was a scholar whose title was Qari'ul Hidayah. Why? Because he used to teach Al-Hidayah continuously, and he used to know the entire book by heart. He memorized it. And I found out by researching in different books, there were 14 people, we got names of 14 people who memorized the entire Al-Hidayah. Nowadays, we don't pay attention to memorization because we are so, our attention is not focused in one thing. We have so many things to do, devices and many other stuff. However, at that time, ulama, they used to encourage their students to memorize, to fill their memory with these beneficial and educational materials. And the names can be found in Al-Madkhal ila Kitab Al-Hidayah and also in some other books related to Al-Hidayah. The second thing that we should remember before we talk about Al-Hidayah, the method, etc., we need to remember that Al-Hidayah is not an ordinary book of fiqh. Rather, Al-Hidayah is a book of fiqh al-muqaran, comparative fiqh, in which the author did not just mention the opinions of Imam Abu Hanifa or the opinion of Hanafi scholars. Rather, he compared between the four well-known madhahib, four well-known schools of law in Islam, Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali. So this is one of the amazing facts about Hidayah, that he did compare between the all mazahib. And not only that, Imam Marghinani rahimahullah also provided the evidences of the masail. When he would say any legal verdict of a mas'ala, like this is jaiz, this is lawful, then he would provide the reason why it is jaiz, because of the traditional evidence like Quran, Hadith, or he will provide logic, like reasoning of this mas'ala. So he would combine between the tradition and logical evidence. And the last point in this page, this is the question of many brothers and sisters. They ask sometimes that, what is the evidence, or what is the source that we know Imam Marghinani, the masail that he mentioned in his book, are these masails actually the masails of Abu Hanifa? He did not mention any chain of narration. This question is already answered in the previous slide. The Imam Marghinani's Al-Hidayah is based on Bidayatul Mubtadi. And Bidayatul Mubtadi is based on two books, Al-Jami' Al-Saghir, which is authored by the student, direct student of Abu Hanifa, and also Mukhtasar Al-Quduri. So therefore, Imam Marghinani, the author of Al-Hidayah, already connected and already told us about his connection and communication to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. How did he get all these masail from? So this is one thing. The second thing is, despite mentioning his base of this book, Al-Bidayatul Mubtadi, Al-Jami' Al-Saghir, etc., we can confirm that Imam Marghinani rahimahullah acquired, he received these masails, these issues of fiqh from Abu Hanifa rahimahullah through a chain of narration. Not just only one chain of narration, rather there are several chains of narration. In Al-Madkhal, this one in book, I mentioned 6 chain of narration from Imam Al-Marghinani to directly Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah through his own chain of narration. So Imam Marghinani didn't just innovated these masail. He didn't just innovate and create this masail from himself. Rather, he has a communication, a chain of narration to Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. But why didn't he mention them in Al-Hidayah? Because there was no need. The book is authored for the readers to get the masail. to get the answers and solutions of the problems. And if he was about to write the chain of narration with each masail, can you imagine that how big would the Kitab Al-Hidayah become? Because he mentioned thousands of masail. And if he mentions chain of narration with each mas'ala, the way we do with hadith, then that would become a book of chain of narration instead of a book of masail, a book of fiqh. And in fiqh, when people refer to fiqh, they don't want the chain of narration, rather they want the solution, the current state of how can we act upon the Quran and how can we act upon the Sunnah. So fiqh is the summary, is the fruit and outcome of the Quran and Sunnah. If you want to know about the chain of narration of the specific tradition, then we should refer to books of hadith, Kutub al-Asanid. But for fiqh, fiqh is already made for us. It's already prepared for us just to get the masail and to implement in our life. So therefore, it was not needed, and it was quite impossible for Marghinani to do that in his book. And before I move on to the next slide, I want to mention two different points which are not written here. The first point is the Al-Hidayah. In the Indian print, in the Indian edition, we have 4 volumes of Al-Hidayah. Obviously, not every edition will be same. Arab editions are different, and we'll talk about Arab editions later on. But in Indian edition, which is widely used in the Islamic seminaries, madrasas in subcontinent India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and many other countries. So that edition has 4 volumes. And Shaykh al-Islam Mufti Muhammad Taqi Uthmani, may Allah protect him, he quotes, he finds out a very interesting point from that. He says, look at these 4 volumes. The chapters that are mentioned in these 4 volumes, you will see that only the first volume contains ibadat. Only the first volume. Ibadat meanings like acts of worship, tahara, wudu, ghusl, etc. Then you got salah, then sawm, and then hajj, zakat. So the first volume is only for ibadat, these ritual actions, activities of Muslim. However, the remaining 3 volumes, they didn't have anything to deal with ibadat. Rather, they deal with other parts of Muslims' life, like social life, family life, international communication between these states and countries, like Kitab al-Siyar, diplomatic relation between the countries, and how to run the court, how to provide legal verdict in the court, etc. So that means a Muslim's life, if you divide a Muslim's life and Muslims' responsibilities, then only 1/4 will be ibadat, and the remaining three portions are not related to ibadat, rather related to our behavior, family relation, and so on. So Mufti Taqi Usmani Hafizahullah, he's trying to say that a Muslim, the way we focus on our ibadat, salah, zakah, sawm, hajj, the same way we need to focus on our transactions, on our family behavior, relation, and nikah, etc., buyu', finance, etc. So a proper Muslim, it's not just about to perform 5 salah a day, rather to maintain all these other responsibilities as well. So that's one thing. Another point that I would like to mention as well is again from Mufti Taqi Uthmani. Mufti Taqi Uthmani's book, those mashallah ulama and scholars, you know this book about this book, Fiqh al-Buyu', which is printed in 2 volumes. So in the introduction, in the beginning of this kitab, of this book, Mufti Muhammad Taqi Uthmani mentions really interesting information. He says that when he was serving in the Supreme Court, in the Sharia appellate branch in the Supreme Court of Pakistan, he was serving as a judge. At that time, they would have meetings, obviously with other colleagues, other judges, and sometimes they would require maybe to draw a conclusion for any problem, to draw a solution for something, for a case. So after discussing and talking about many legal issues and their legal theories of Pakistani courts or etc., like laws, they would all go back to Mufti Muhammad Taqi Usmani's explanation or his solution. Like, his understanding of law was so good that they all admired and they all were amazed by him. So at some point, the Chief Justice at that time, he admired Mufti Taqi Usmani's understanding. And some of the colleagues of Mufti Taqi Usmani, he said, you know, Mufti Taqi Usmani does that because he studied LLB, he studied law. So then Mufti Taqi Usmani replied to that. He denied. He said, no, my understanding of laws, even secular laws, is not because of my studying law in university. In fact, I studied for a very short time. I just did the exam. I took the exam and I didn't, attend many lessons, in fact. However, my understanding of laws, even the secular laws, is actually derived from my study of Al-Hidayah, of Islamic fiqh. So therefore, it demonstrates, it illustrates, and it shows to us that if we actually pay attention to our traditional legacy, sometimes we don't pay attention to that. If we actually pay attention to our legacy, our rich legacy, Muslim traditional inheritance and heritage, if we appreciate these works, then inshallah, we will not be able just to learn the masail of fiqh, rather we will be able to run the country and to provide solutions of the current problems, financial problems, and many other problems. So this is important to know that Hidayah is not just about something about ibadat only, or something about the early ages of Islam, early centuries of Islam. Rather, it is still relevant to us. If we study the book Al-Hidayah properly and Islamic fiqh properly, then we can implement these rulings and principles even in our time, inshallah. Let's move on to the next slide, where we'll be talking about the method of Al-Marghinani in his book Al-Hidayah. One thing I need to notice here, that when we teach Al-Hidayah in our madrasas, in our traditional Islamic seminaries, we talk about adat of Sahib Hidayah, the habits and method of Imam Al-Marghinani, the author of Hidayah, in his book. We talk about when he says qala, what does he mean? When he says mashayikhuna and this and that. I'm not going to talk about these points here. I don't think it's that important for us to discuss this in this short webinar. Rather, we'll talk about few important aspects related to the method of Al-Hidayah, the method of Al-Marghinani in his book Al-Hidayah. The first thing is already mentioned, that Imam Marghinani rahimahullah compared between the different schools of law in Islam. For example, Hanbali, Maliki, Shafi, Hanafi, obviously. So, however, he mostly mentioned Imam Shafi'i. He mentioned him about 640 places. And secondly, he mentioned from other schools of law, he mentioned Imam Malik in 103 places. So he mentioned their opinions, and then obviously he compared their evidences with the evidence of Imam Abu Hanifa, and why Abu Hanifa preferred, or Hanafi Mazhab preferred this opinion, or this like hadith, or this dalil, this evidence over the other evidence, over the evidence of the other A'imma. So he provided those reasonings as well, wujuhut tarjih. And the third point, as you can see here, Imam Marghinani rahimahullah is really important and is vital for the muftis, for those who are involved in providing legal verdict for Muslims. That Imam Marghinani rahimahullah, he did not just quote masail and just mention and explain the masail from a fiqh perspective only. Rather, he related those masail, those issues, to his own time, place, town, and also to the opinions of his own teachers. That, for example, you see, when you study Al-Hidayah, you see that Marghinani says, وَفِي دِيَارِنَا. So first he mentions the mas'ala, the general ruling of this issue, and then he would say, وَفِي دِيَارِنَا, meaning in our town, in our area, in Uzbekistan, like Ma'ura'un Nahar, the hukum is like that, or the situation or the scenario is different. Or he would say, وَفِي زَمَانِنَا, in our time. So he would relate the mas'ala, after mentioning the general rule, he would relate the mas'ala to his own time and own place. And sometimes he will say, وَفِي قَوْلِ مَشَايِخِنَا, like his own teacher's opinion. He would quote their opinion. Because sometimes, as I said, fiqh is the current state of how can we act upon the Sharia. How can we follow the Quran? How can we follow the Sunnah? How can we abide by the Sharia law? So fiqh tells us the current state of this hukum. So therefore, Imam Marghinani rahimahullah, he did that. He related the masail to practical life, to real life as well. And this is what a mufti should do. And the next point, as you can see, he referred the fiqhi masails, some of the particular fiqhi masails, to the relevant specialists of that subject. This is also important. For example, in Kitab al-Sawm of Al-Hidayah, you will see, after mentioning a mas'ala, Imam Marghinani rahimahullah is saying, وَهَذَا لَيْسَ مِنْ بَابِ الْفِقْهِ وَهَذَا لَيْسَ مِنْ بَابِ الْفِقْهِ, that this mas'ala or this issue is not related to fiqh. It's not from the chapters of fiqh, from the subject and field of fiqh. Rather, it's related to tib, it's related to medical science. So what do we learn from that? We learn that sometimes a mufti, in order to give answers, he needs to refer to the experts of that particular subject, to the doctors, to the other, experts of the other subjects as well. And alhamdulillah, our mufti, they do that. I'm saying that these characters, these have been passed on to us from our elderly, from our early scholars. They maintained that. They didn't just isolated themselves from the real life just to in books and libraries. Rather, they would follow the real life and they would relate the masails to the real life. So Imam Marghinani used to do that. Imam Marghinani used to, in his book Al-Hidayah, he said in some places that this mas'ala, I just mentioned the scenario, but the hukum, the actual conclusion can be drawn by referring to the experts of that subject. And this is the sunnah, this is the teaching of Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam as well. We see in the hadith of Sunan at-Tirmidhi, on the authority of Sahabi Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu, Rasul sallam saying that أعلمهم بالحلال والحرام معاذ بن جبل وأفرضهم, meaning Rasul sallam, he's saying to his Sahaba that even though you all studied under me, you all learned from me, but some of them are special, they are specialists of some subject. For example, أعلمهم بالحلال والحرام معاذ بن جبل. Muaz ibn Jabal radiallahu anhu was expert of halal and haram. Zayd ibn Thabit radiallahu anhu was expert of fara'id, inheritance. Ubay ibn Ka'ab was expert of qira'ah, aqra'uhuma Ubay ibn Ka'ab. So to refer to the expert of this subject is actually something that was taught by Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He instructed that. And then we see in our tradition, ulama say that يرجع في كل فن إلى أهله, that in every subject of knowledge, people should refer themselves to the experts of that particular subject. Nowadays, sometimes we get confused and misguided because sometimes we forget to follow this rule. Sometimes we try to learn masail from the person who is not expert, who is not specialized in this field. However, Imam Marghinani didn't do that. Imam Marghinani rahimahullah, he referred the issues to the relevant specialists of that subject. Another point that we can learn, which is important for the students of knowledge, is that Imam Marghinani rahimahullah, he would indicate to the defenses of manuscripts of his resources. Obviously, he got masail, he got information from different books, he used different resources. So when he would refer to them, sometimes he would say, وَفِي بَعْضِ النُّسَخ, meaning in some manuscript, the word has been written like that, or the text has been put like this way. So this is also important. And I think we spoke about the different manuscripts in a webinar organized by Siblings of Ilm in December last year, that it's really important for the students of knowledge to acquire different copies of the kitab in order to get the actual and real point of the book. Sometimes some publications, they don't follow the rules, and they just print the books however they are. And there are obviously typing errors, printing errors, that are normal. However, also there are some mistakes, like in terms of information, etc. So it's important for a student of knowledge to acquire different nuskhas when you are making any decision or drawing a conclusion for something. Then when you rely on a book, you should rely on the most correct version of that book. Okay, and the final point here, he introduced many principles of fiqh. Imam Al-Mahullah rahimahullah, he in his book, he didn't just say, okay, the hukum is that and the reason is that. Rather, he also told us some general principles based on which we can derive many masail. We can use these principles for our current issues and affairs, for current problems. In order to make solution, in order to draw solution for them, we can use these principles. And alhamdulillah, the scholars after Marghinani, they paid attention to those principles as well. And some of them, they dedicated books just to gather all these principles that can be derived and taken from Al-Hidayah. And one of the book is called Muhadhab Al-Hidayah. Muhadhab Al-Hidayah is authored by Allama Muhammad Hussain Al-Ansari, the paternal uncle of Allama Muhammad Abid As-Sindhi. Everyone knows about Abid As-Sindhi, the great muhaddith. So his paternal uncle was Muhammad Hussain Al-Ansari, and he wrote Muhadhab Al-Hidayah. This is also included in Al-Madkhal ila Kitab Al-Hidayah. If you look at it, you'll see the Muhadhab Al-Hidayah is there, and Allama Muhammad Hussain Al-Ansari, he found out, he outlined, he made a list of the principles, fiqhi principles that can be derived from Al-Hidayah. After that, in recent times, in our contemporary time, we see many researchers, many scholars, they also did some sort of research work on usul and on principles of Al-Hidayah, Ad-Dawabitul Al-Fiqhiyya. We have seen many books now, mashallah, coming out on this particular subject. So we should acquire these as well in order to understand how the fiqh works and how these problem can be solved. Here are a few pictures, and I want to show you this picture. The picture that you see here is, it is said that this is the earliest handwritten copy of Al-Hidayah, and this copy of Al-Hidayah is preserved in the library of International Islamic Academy of Uzbekistan. So it is still there, and they wrote in the description that this is the earliest manuscript of Al-Hidayah which survived till today. And last year they made a copy, an edition of these handwritten copies of Al-Hidayah. They made it a book and they gifted to the different scholars when they had a conference about it. And then this picture, this nuskha of Al-Hidayah is interesting. As you can see here, that this nuskha was scribed, this manuscript was scribed in Makkah al-Mukarramah, in Jabal Abu Qubais, in the year Hijri year 960, about 500 years ago. So this nuskha of Al-Hidayah was scribed, was written on Jabal Abu Qubais, in this blessed place. And this is one of the, not the earliest, but one of the earliest edition of Al-Hidayah, printed version of Al-Hidayah, which was printed in Cairo in Egypt in 1936. But we should remember there were different editions even before that in subcontinent India. Maulana Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi's edition of Al-Hidayah and many other editions of Al-Hidayah, they were done even before this edition of Egyptian edition. However, this edition was specifically done because this is مقرر تدريسه لطلبة كلية الشريعة الإسلامية بالجامعة الأزهرية. It was included in the syllabus, in the curriculum of Jamia Azhariya. And in terms of early editions of Hidayah in subcontinent India, even the handwritten copies that used to be in subcontinent India, many of them are now held in the British Library. It's quite interesting. When I was searching in their catalog of manuscripts, I found out that more than 7 or 8, as far as I recall, of manuscripts, handwritten copies of Al-Hidayah are held in British Library. And thousands of Islamic manuscripts are preserved and held in the British Library. But it's hard to mention that how many of us, those who are living in this country, in London or in the UK, how many of us go and visit British Library, where our heritage, our inheritance, the legacy of our early scholars are held and preserved. I don't exactly remember. A few years back, I read, I think in the Daily Guardian, and the title was something like that the majority manuscripts, Islamic manuscripts, are in the British libraries, in different libraries of England, are stolen. And that's true. Yes, they purchased, perhaps they bought some manuscripts from different areas, different places. However, many of these manuscripts were taken from India when they were ruling India. So I saw by my eyes many copies of Al-Hidayah, early editions and handwritten copies in the library of British, in British Library. Now, we'll have a small, brief discussion here about the Hadith of Al-Hidayah. As I said, that Imam Marghinani rahimahullah, he did not just mention masla or issues of fiqh, rather he presented the evidence from Quran, obviously, and also from Hadith. As you can see, Imam Marghinani rahimahullah, he quoted about 1,540 Hadith in his book, Al-Hidayah. This is quite a large number, because Hidayah is not a book of Hadith to mention just Hadith again, one after another. This is the summary, or this is the fruit and outcome of the Hadith, not the book of Hadith. But still, mashallah, Al-Marghinani rahimahullah, he presented more than 1,500 Hadith in his book as evidence. And when I say Hadith, it does not just mean the Hadith of Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, it also includes the athar, the statements of Sahaba. Because it is important to note that when our early ulama, scholars, muhaddithun, scholars of hadith, they say a large number of hadith, they don't just mean the statements of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They also, in that large number, they include the statements of Sahaba, and sometimes the statements of Tabi'in as well. So no one should be confused about that number. Sometimes people ask me that how can these number of hadith were at that time and now we don't have these many hadith now? Because one of the largest collection of hadith today is Kanzul Ummal, and it doesn't have even more than it has even less than 50,000 hadith, and there are some of them are repeated. And in Musnad Ahmad, we have about 30,000 hadith. Some of them are repeated again. So where are these, 200, 300,000 hadith? Sometimes we see Imam Abu Dawud, Imam Bukhari, they choose their book from 300,000 hadiths, 500,000, 4,000, 100,000 hadiths. Where are these hadiths now? Did they get lost or something? The answer is very simple. The first thing is, when ulama say these large number, they don't only mean the statements of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They also include the statements of Sahaba and Tabi'in. This is the first thing to remember. And the second thing is, and we have, mashallah, collection of the statements of Sahaba and Tabi'in as well, like Musannaf Ibn Abi Shayba, Musannaf Abdul Razak, and many other books. And the second thing is, when ulama say these large number of hadith, they also they just doesn't mean, they don't mean the hadith, the wordings and matan itself. Rather, they mean these large number in terms of sanad as well. For example, a same text, a same matan has been reported, narrated from different sahabi or from different sources. Like sahabis may be same, but his students are not same. So it got like apart from here, and it got two different chain of narration, three different chain of narration. Maybe sometimes there are differences of wordings. Some said in this word, some said in other word, like synonyms. So all these narrations, small points, also counted as a different number of hadith. So therefore, this is how the number became so high. In reality, they don't mean all these number as text of hadith or the statements of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, let's go back to this point. Imam Al-Marghinani rahimahullah, he mentioned 1,540 hadith, and sometimes Imam Marghinani rahimahullah comments on these hadiths, because Imam Marghinani was a scholar of hadith. As I said, in his mashayikh, he mentioned from the teachers from whom he learned the books of hadith. And one of the masters of hadith, Allama Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, rahimahullah, who died in 748 Hijri, in his book Siyaru A'lam al-Nubala, and in his book Tariq al-Islam, he mentioned Imam Marghinani with the good titles, Al-Imam, Al-Allama, all these words. So Imam Marghinani was a scholar of hadith as well as a scholar of fiqh. So Imam Marghinani, in some places you will see in Hidayah, he comments on the hadith, like this hadith is da'if. Sometimes he would say, in one place he said, da'afahu Abu Dawood. And the commentators after Marghinani, they were trying to find out which Abu Dawud is meant. Is it Abu Dawud at-Tayalusi or Abu Dawud as-Sijistani, the author, the compiler of Sunan? That's different discussion. I'm not going to into this discussion now. But the point is, Imam Marghinani rahimahullah referred and quoted the comments of the, even sometimes he quotes the comment of Yahya ibn Ma'in rahimahullah, da'afahu Yahya. So that shows, that demonstrates the interest of Imam Marghinani in the book, in hadith as well, in his book Al-Hidayah. Now, these ahadith are mentioned not for the purpose of narrating hadith. We need to understand this point. These hadiths are mentioned for the purpose of deriving ahkam from them, to learn, to derive masail from them. So therefore, you will see in some places, he didn't pay much attention to report the exact words of the hadith, because he's not about it. His point is different. His point is to show that the mas'ala is derived from this hadith, from this tradition. And it is allowed in the hadith literature that riwayat bil ma'na, a narrator who is qualified, who has knowledge of Arabic language and hadith, etc., who is qualified, he sometimes, when he's needed, he can narrate the hadith with a synonym words in different wordings, as long as he can fulfill, as long as he can, he can pass the message across, then he can narrate the hadith with his own wording in Arabic. So Imam Marghinani did that because he was a hafiz of hadith, he was a great scholar of expert of hadith, and he was qualified. So he was allowed, permissible. He was allowed to narrate the hadith. In some places, maybe he shortened the hadith. Some places he reworded the hadith, and that was absolutely fine, even in terms of hadith literature. And these hadiths that Imam Marghinani rahimahullah mentioned in his book, this can be located from the well-known 6 books of hadith and well-known collections of hadith: Bukhari, Muslim, Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, Daraqutni, all these other books of hadith. And also ulama, after Imam Marghinani, they dedicated. This shows how important this book is. The ulama dedicated books, not one volume or small brief booklet, rather detailed and more than one volume's book on the Hadith of Al-Hidayah. They did takhrij, found out the sources of the Hadith. They located these Hadiths to their original sources. One of these work is the work called Nasb al-Raya by Allama Jamaluddin al-Zailai. There are two Zailai. Zaila is a place in Ethiopia, nowadays in Somalia. So Habasha. So Jamaluddin al-Zailai rahimahullah and Fakhruddin al-Zailai before him. So Jamaluddin al-Zailai rahimahullah is the author of Nasb al-Raya fi takhrij Hadith Al-Hidayah or li Hadith Al-Hidayah, who died in 762 AH, before the well-known scholar of Hadith Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, but after Shamsuddin Zahabi. So his book Nasb al-Raya is not just a source of hadith for Hanafi fiqh, rather it is one of the important source for hadith literature as general. You will see Maliki, Hanbali, Shafi, they all refer to the book Nasb al-Raya because it's so great and excellent and exceptional work was done by Jamaluddin al-Zailai rahimahullah, to an extent that Imam Marghinani rahimahullah made a shorter version of Nasb al-Raya, and he named his summary as Ad-Diraya, which is also printed, available nowadays. Nasb al-Raya is also available in 4 volumes, and in some places they both, Zailai and Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahumullah, sometimes they couldn't locate some few narration to the sources. So then Allama Qasim ibn Qutlubuga rahimahullah, he came, who died in 879, and he made another work. He did another work called Munyatul al-Ma'i fima fata min takhrij al-ahadith al-hidayah al-Zailai. So in that book, Ibn Qutlubuga, Qasim ibn Qutlubuga, he located those ahadith that were unlocated by, or that were couldn't located by Zailai and Ibn Hajar. So Qasim ibn Qutlubuga, he referred to many other sources and he located them. Finally, very briefly, I want to mention this point that Shaykh Muhammad Awwama Hafizahullah has really good explanation of the ahadith of Kutub al-Fiqh. Sometimes a person, an individual, looks at the books of hadith, and when he does not see maybe Rawah al-Bukhari or Rawah Muslim, Tirmidhi, he thinks these ahadith have no base, which is not the case. In reality, these ahadith have base, and they are actually referred to the books of hadith, or they are referred to directly Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam through the chain of narration of the author himself. So here, few points to remember. One is the ahadith or the evidence, the dalil, the evidence that are mentioned in Al-Hidayah or in any book of fiqh, they are not necessarily the evidence of the Imam of the Mazhab. Maybe Imam of the Mazhab based this mas'ala on a different hadith, and the author, the writer who came after him, he got the mas'ala, and obviously not all the place have the dalil. So in order to find a dalil for this mas'ala, the author later on, he, from his own knowledge, he mentioned another hadith. So it's not necessarily the hadith which was the evidence for the Imam of the Mazhab. It can be different. And sometimes you'll see the dalil of Imam the Madhab, the Madhab of Imam, his dalil is more stronger than the dalil that is mentioned in Al-Hidayah or in some other books of fiqh. This is one point. Another point is the hadith that is mentioned in Al-Hidayah or in any other book of fiqh, even though the hadith is the evidence of the madhab, however, the hadith is not taken from the well-known books of hadith. Rather, the hadith is reported by the chain of narration of the author himself. As I said, Marghinani, he has his own chain of narration. He died in 593. So he was closer to that time. So he had his own chain of narration. So maybe you are looking for the hadith in maybe Tirmidhi, but Marghinani narrated the hadith from his own chain of narration. So therefore, it should be also remembered. Another point is maybe the hadith that Marghinani rahimahullah or any author of fiqh book that he mentioned the hadith, maybe this hadith is found in the books of hadith. Maybe the sanad you can see is not that great, but this sanad is through the well-known book Tirmizi or well-known book. Maybe it's not great, but through the sanad of the author himself, his tone of narration is greater, is authentic, or is sahih. So we can't just make a decision and comment that, oh, this hadith is da'if, because you need to look and need to refer yourself to the original source of the author himself. And many other explanations to that as well, which can be found in our Shaykh Muhammad Awama's book, Athar al-Hadith al-Sharif, which has been translated into English as well, the influence of the noble hadith upon the defenses of jurist imams. You can have a look at that book as well, inshallah. Now, literary works related to Al-Hidayah. If we go on discussing this point, it will require a long time, and we have only 12 minutes left. So as you see, I have mentioned few literary works related to Al-Hidayah. There can be hundreds of work mentioned, hundreds of literary works can be mentioned in regards to Al-Hidayah, and they can be categorized in these 10 categories. For example, takhrij, finding the sources of the hadith, as I mentioned, nasb al-raya, diraya, and others. Sharh, commentary, for example, al-binaya of Badruddin al-Aini, and Fath al-Qadir of Allama ibn al-Humam, great sharh of Hidayah. Many sharh, they said, more than 50 sharh can be mentioned. However, these two sharh are like amongst the important shuru of Al-Hidayah, and a student of knowledge when studying Hidayah should and must refer to these two sharh at least. Fath al-Qadir is more so evidence-based. Imam Ibn al-Humam rahimahullah, he quotes hadith, he goes on logic, theoretical perspective. From theoretical perspective, he mentions the authenticity of the dalail and so on. So in terms of dalail, in terms of evidence, a person should refer to Fath al-Qadir. And Imam Ibn al-Humam, he himself was a great muhaddith. And al-Binaya of Allama Badruddin al-Aini is good in terms of sharh, in terms of explaining the words, the meaning of the words, etc. So a person should refer to al-Binaya as well. And in terms of hadith as well, Imam Badruddin al-Aini, you know all, he was the author of Umdatul Qari. And one thing about al-Binaya, that Mufti Taqi Uthmani Sahib, he included al-Binaya amongst those books which are not reliable for fatwa to provide a legal verdict based on al-Binaya, because al-Binaya's edition that we have are not that great. They have issues with printing errors, etc. However, now Multani edition is the best one. That's a different discussion. And then we have Hashiyah of Al-Hidayah, marginal notes to Al-Hidayah, especially the Hashiyah of Imam Laknawi and Hashiyah of Sambali. They are great Hashiyah of Hidayah. Then Talkhis summary, Al-Wiqaya, and then you got the Sharh al-Wiqaya, then got Nuqaya, then Fathu Bab al-Inaya, and so on. So other things I mentioned, number 9, you can see Taqdima, introductory works related to Al-Hidayah. Some ulama, they wrote introduction to Al-Hidayah. For example, Imam Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi wrote a detailed introduction to Al-Hidayah, Muqaddimatul Hidayah. And Maulana Hifzur Rahman al-Kumillai from Bangladesh, he also wrote an Arabic introduction to Al-Hidayah, Ma yanbaghi bihi al-inayah liman yutali'u al-Hidayah, which is also very detailed. And mashallah, he mentioned the biographies of all those people related to Imam Marghinani and Al-Hidayah. Another introduction which has been published recently and really nice is the Muqaddimah of Hidayah written by Ustadh Saeed Bagdash. His edition, as I have it in front of mine, Ustadh Saeed Bagdash, he edited Al-Hidayah, the new edition of Al-Hidayah. And before he started his work, he made a detailed introduction, about 200 pages, and really beneficial and informative Muqaddimah. I would recommend anyone to read the Muqaddimah. And he presented about 30 pages of the different handwritten copies of Al-Hidayah, which is something nice to see. Another collection as an introductory work for Hidayah is my Al-Madkhal ila Kitab Al-Hidayah, which is a compilation of about 6 risalas related to Al-Hidayah. We'll talk about it briefly in a few minutes. And then Tarjama, translation into Persian, English, Urdu, Bengali, Turkish, and many other languages. We have many translations of Al-Hidayah, but I'd like to mention few words about the English translation of Al-Hidayah. Oh, this is something ulama will appreciate, and they will like, we can learn lesson from here. This page is taken from the Khatima, from the final words of Badruddin Al-Aini in his Sharh of Hidayah called Al-Binaya. He said, I worked this, I wrote this kitab, and you should excuse my errors if I made any errors, any mistakes. However, the hasid, the jealousy, the person who has a bad intention, he will not admire the work, rather he will complain, and he will announce in the world, like he will tell other people, oh, you know, this work is bad, etc. So he said very nice words. I would say, I ask the students of knowledge to read the paragraph from the end of Al-Binaya. He said he worked on Al-Binaya when he was about 90 years old. Can you imagine? And Ghalibul, as you can see here, okay, Ghalibul Kitaba fil Layali. So he wrote the kitab, most of the work was done at night time. Subhanallah. So this is actually something that can motivate us, that our elderly ulama, our early scholars, how much efforts and endeavors they made in terms of preserving the hadith, in terms of preserving fiqh, in terms of preserving the Islamic legacy for us. This is a copy of taken from a manuscript, Allama Qiwamuddin, from his Sharh. He says that وَكَانَ جَمِيعُ مُدَّةِ الشَّرْحِ 26 سَنَةً و17 أشهر و17 يوما. Very long. Like, it took him to complete the Sharh of Hidayah 26 years, 17 months, and 7 months and 17 days. So that means sometimes we should have some works which have long, lifelong like project. Look at Imam Marghinani. He produced Al-Hidayah in 13 years. Look at these. Al-Binaya also was produced in about 30 years. This one also about 26. Many books we find in Islam, Ibn Hajar's Fathul Bari and other books, they were produced in long time. Ulama took time to produce. That shows two things. One is their passionate and continuousness of the work. They didn't just stop in between, rather they continued throughout these long period. And the second thing is that they took time. They were calm and took time to produce a good qualified work. And recently, Allama Mufti Muhammad Taqi Uthmani also did same with Takmila Fathul Mulhim, which took him about 17, 18 years. Obviously, that doesn't mean every day he was doing the same thing. He did other things, but the point is he continued and he produced a good, excellent, exceptional work. This is another page. I don't have time. Inshallah, we'll share these slides with those who attended today, inshallah. So you'll see in this manuscript, in this page, there's a nice comment, interesting comment perhaps from a scribe. And Ibn Humam didn't complete his Sharah because he died before completing. So Qazi Zada, he completed the Sharah, Nata'ij al-Afkar, like Fathul Qadir. The first translation of English, like English translation of Al-Hidayah, was done by the Orientalist Charles Hamilton. Charles Hamilton, he died in 1792, and he was born in 1753 or 1752. So he was the first person to translate Al-Hidayah into English, and his translation is still available. You can purchase it, and also available online, PDF. But few things to remember, that his translation was funded by the East India Company when they were ruling subcontinent India. They funded so they can rule Muslims according to their own rules. And another point is Charles Hamilton's translation was not directly from Arabic. This is a shortcoming, perhaps, of his translation, because he didn't translate it directly from Arabic. He translated from from a Persian translation of Al-Hidayah. So it is secondary translation, not directly from Al-Hidayah. And he omitted many texts and left them without translation. This is another thing, that he did not translate the evidence, the dalail, the reasoning of the masail. He left them empty. But mashallah, we have a new translation of Al-Hidayah, which is quite good, which is far more explicit than the translation of Charles Hamilton, which was printed in 2006 by Ahsan Khan Niazi. Imran Ahsan Khan Niazi, he translated, and his translation is good. I have this translation in front of me. This is printed in 2 volumes, and mashallah, he wrote an introduction to this version as well. And as I said, it's far more better than the translation of Charles Hamilton. One thing, he admired and he appreciated the translation of Charles Hamilton. He said he was sincere in his translation. So some of the Orientalists, they were good. They were sincere in their academic works related to Islam and Muslim. However, some of them, they were in the other side. Let's have a look at this picture. So this is the first picture, as you can see, the picture of the first edition of Hidayah. You can see, interestingly, commentary on the Musalman law. Obviously, Indian name, Indian word, like the word Musalman. So he used the word Musalman. And you can see in this picture, the shortcoming of the translation. The whole chapter, paragraphs in Arabic was translated into English, but without the evidence. You see, if you look at the translation, you will see there is no translation of the evidence. And this is Al-Madkhal, inshallah, I'll mention in 2 minutes. So Al-Madkhal ila Kitab Al-Hidayah is a compilation of 6 books related to Al-Hidayah. The first one is Al-Aqd Samin. I already mentioned about it. The second one is Muqaddimatul Hidayah. Is actually third one. The second one is Muhazzabul Hidayah, as I mentioned. Muqaddimatul Hidayah is by Laknawi, as I already mentioned. And the fourth one is this one, Misbahud Diraya fi Istilah Al-Hidayah, which is authored by Mahmud Afendi Al-Hamzawi. And he died 1 year after Imam Abdullah Laknawi. And then Bughiyatu Ahli Diraya min Khatmi Kitab Al-Hidayah. Interestingly, this Shaykh Muhammad Bakhit Al-Muti'i, the Shaykh Al-Azhar, he used to arrange a program, the way we do with Bukhari, like a program of completion of Bukhari. So he used to do a gathering on the completion of Hidayah. When he would complete teaching Hidayah, he would make a program. And this book is based on his lecture on the final lessons of lesson of Al-Hidayah. This is Mabahisu an al-Imam al-Maghinani wa Kitab al-Hidayah, author, like written by myself. I was given the kitab to teach in Jamia Madani Angura Muhammadpur in 2013 when I started teaching there. And then I made some notes related to Hidayah, and this is the note. At the end of the Al-Madkhal, I included a detailed article of our respected Shaykh Maulana Mufti Yusuf Shabbir Ahmad from Blackburn. MashaAllah, he wrote an article about the word Maulana, because Abdul Hayy Laknawi uses the word Maulana very often in his kitabs. So I thought it would be